What happens when a father's love feels like it has an expiration date? For Ishmael, the answer didn't come with a bang, but with the cheerful sound of laughter that wasn't for him. Standing there, in the middle of the party celebrating the weaning of Isaac, his half-brother, the son of the promise, he felt it. He felt the exact moment he became a stranger in his own father's house. The air smelled of celebration, of victory, and of a future that he, at almost 16, was suddenly no longer a part of. There was a time, not so long ago, when he was the future, the firstborn, the heir to Abraham's legacy, the apprentice with the bow, the living proof that his father's God was faithful. He was the first star in a sky full of promise, the laughter that echoed through the camp. But Isaac's birth had shifted the center of gravity. Now Ishmael was just a shadow cast by the glare of this new sun, a walking reminder of a faith that, in Sarah's eyes, had been too weak. He felt the weight of her stare every single day. It was a sharp-edged gaze that sized him up, judged him, and condemned him in silence. Sarah, the mother of the miracle child, saw a threat in Ishmael's every move. It wasn't just jealousy. It was the primal fear of a mama bear protecting her cub. And he, the older cub from another litter, was a presence she could no longer tolerate in the sacred territory of her family. The storm finally broke over something small, something innocent. Isaac, little and laughing, was chasing Ishmael, who was waving a toy bow, mimicking the hunting stories their father told. It was just boys being boys. But when Sarah's eyes fell on the scene, the innocence shattered. She didn't see a game. She saw a mockery, a dark omen. She saw the son of the Egyptian slave, making fun of the son of the promise, and in her heart, the final door of tolerance slammed shut. Before we dive deep into the pain that followed this moment, I'd love to know where you're tuning in from. It's an incredible joy to know that these stories of faith and resilience can touch hearts in so many different places, from the coasts of California to the shores of Nova Scotia, uniting us. Drop a comment below and tell me what city you're watching from. Now, get ready for the incredible journey of Ishmael, a young man who, with raw courage and vulnerability, faced the ultimate rejection. You're about to learn how the feeling of being abandoned can actually be the start of a life-changing encounter with God, and how you can apply that strength to your own life to face down crisis and overcome. Let's get into it. Sarah's words that night were like stones, sharpened to wound. "Get that slave woman and her son out of here," she demanded of Abraham, her voice trembling with a mix of fury and fear. "The son of that slave will not be an heir with my son Isaac." From outside the tent, hidden by the darkness, Ishmael heard his own death sentence. Not the death of his body, not yet, but the death of his name, his place, his identity as Abraham's son. That was the longest night of Abraham's life. The patriarch, the friend of God, was torn in two. His love for Ishmael, his first son, warred against the divine whisper in his heart telling him to listen to Sarah. It was an obedience that felt like a betrayal, a leap of faith that required sacrificing a piece of his own soul. The same God who had asked him to believe in a promise was now asking him to cast part of it out. The dawn came, cold and merciless. With a heart as heavy as a stone, Abraham woke them. He gave Hagar, Ishmael's mother, a little bread and a leather skin of water. The father's eyes couldn't meet the son's. The silence between them was deeper than any canyon. It was a goodbye without words, an eviction disguised as a journey, the final act of a love that was surrendering to a greater, more painful purpose. Ishmael didn't look back. He fixed his gaze on the horizon, where the sky met the sand, feeling the heat of his mother's silent tears on his back. With every step, the sounds of the camp, the only home he had ever known, grew fainter until they were completely swallowed by the oppressive silence of the Beersheba desert. He hadn't just been sent away, he was being erased. The hot sand under his feet was the new ground floor of his existence. The sun, just beginning its climb, was no longer a promise of a new day, but an enemy watching from above. He and his mother were alone. Two tiny figures in a vast emptiness, carrying a rejection as wide and empty as the desert before them. The question screaming in his soul was a single, desperate, silent echo: why? The first day in the desert was a silent war against the sun. The heat rose from the sand in shimmering waves, like asphalt on a Texas highway in August, turning the air into a furnace. Ishmael walked with a forced stiffness, the pride of a young man fighting not to buckle. He refused to show weakness in front of his mother, faking a strength that was evaporating with every step. The silence between them was absolute, filled only by the drag of their feet in the sand and the sloshing sound of the water in the leather canteen. Hagar watched her son from the corner of her eye. She knew this silence. It was the same one that had surrounded her years ago when she first fled from Sarah. But back then, she carried Ishmael in her womb, a secret promise. Now he walked beside her, and his despair was a far heavier burden. This wasn't the cry of a baby, but the growing bitterness in the eyes of a young man who felt he'd been cut from the team, who'd lost everything. The water, the source of life, became the countdown to their death. Every sip was measured, moistening cracked lips but never quenching the profound thirst that consumed them. The bread, dry and hard, scratched their throats. Ishmael began to feel the true weight of his father's abandonment. These provisions weren't for a journey, they were a final gesture. A way for Abraham to not have to watch the death he himself had ordered. During a rare stop, under the pathetic shade of a rock, the first crack appeared in Ishmael's armor. He looked at his mother's empty hands, then up at the cruel, endless blue sky. "Mother." His voice was a rasp, a foreign sound in the silence. "My father's God. Does he walk on this dust too?" The question hung in the air, not as a search for faith, but as the beginning of an accusation. How many times, in our own private deserts, have we asked God that same question? If you've ever felt your faith waver in the face of silence, if you've ever wondered where the promise was in the middle of your pain, know that this feeling is part of the journey. Your story isn't a mistake, and your cry, even in doubt, is being heard. The landscape around them was a mirror of Ishmael's soul. No trees, no green, just rock, sand, and a hot wind that blew like a desolate sigh. Mirages danced in the distance, false oases promising relief and delivering only more despair. The physical desert and the desert in his heart had become one, a place where hope came to die. Finally, thirst and exhaustion broke the last dam. In a burst of fury and pain, Ishmael stopped and turned on Hagar, his eyes burning with unshed tears and resentment. "Where is he now?" he screamed, his voice tearing. "The God of Abraham abandoned us. Isaac got the blessing, the camp, and a father's love. And us? We get the desert. This is our inheritance. Death." Hagar took the words like physical blows. Her face crumpled in deep sorrow, not at the accusation, but at seeing her son's spirit break. There was no anger in her eyes, only an ocean of sadness. She had no answers, no theology, no promises to offer him. All she had was the same sun, the same sand, the same sentence. She just shook her head slowly, tears finally carving dirty tracks through the dust on her face. The scream brought Ishmael no relief. The anger, once spent, left behind an even greater void. He had said the unspeakable, accused the God of stars and promises, and the only answer he got was the echo of his own voice and his mother's silent weeping. The sky didn't part. No angel appeared. God's silence was the confirmation of everything he feared. He wasn't the son of the promise, he was the son of nothing. They kept walking. But now, the dynamic had changed forever. They were no longer mother and son on a journey. They were two souls stripped of all hope. bound only by suffering and the certainty of the approaching end. The small flame of pride that had kept Ishmael upright had been extinguished. Now he just moved on instinct, one foot in front of the other, drunk on sun and despair, walking toward the place where his body and his faith would finally surrender. The days that followed blurred into a haze of suffering. The sun was no longer just an enemy, it was a hunter. It stalked them without mercy, baking the little moisture left in their bodies. Ishmael's skin, once tanned by the camp sun, was now burned and cracked. His lips bled, and his vision blurred, the world becoming a shimmering landscape of heat and sand. The end of hope came with a hollow sound. Hagar, her hands trembling, turned the leather skin upside down over Ishmael's open mouth one last time. Nothing. A single, muddy drop rolled over the edge and was lost in the sand. She let the canteen fall. The dull thud of empty leather on the ground was the sound of a final decree. The water was gone, life was ending. Ishmael's body gave out first. His legs, once strong and agile, refused to obey. He stumbled, fell to his knees, and then collapsed face down onto the scorching sand. He tried to push himself up, but his muscles wouldn't respond. The world spun in a vortex of light and darkness. He was now just a dead weight in the vastness of nothing. Hagar, seeing her son lying there, felt a pain that surpassed thirst, hunger, and the fear of death. It was the pain of a mother forced to watch the end of her own flesh. Unable to bear the sight, she used her last ounce of strength to drag him a few feet to the insignificant shade of a small shrub. It was a futile gesture against the sun, but it was the last act of care she could offer. Then, she did the hardest thing of her life. She walked away. The Bible says she went about a bowshot's distance away, a safe space where she wouldn't have to hear the last gasps of her boy. She wasn't abandoning him. She was protecting the last fragment of her mother's heart. She sat on the sand, buried her head in her knees, and began to sob. A loud, ragged cry, the sound of absolute loss. Alone under the shrub, Ishmael felt life draining away. He had hit rock bottom. Rejected by his earthly father, ignored by his heavenly Father, and now even his mother had moved away to wait for his death. He was no longer the son of Abraham, no longer the firstborn, no longer anything. He was just a feverish body being slowly reclaimed by the desert. He felt completely canceled, erased from the book of life. In his final thoughts there was no more anger. The bitterness had been scorched away by the sun, the accusation silenced by exhaustion. All that was left was emptiness. A complete and total surrender. He didn't ask for rescue, didn't plead for a miracle. He simply accepted it. With a final, shaky breath, he closed his eyes, giving himself over not to peace, but to total defeat. The world, with its parties and its promises, faded to black. It is in this place, at the end of all our strength, that something extraordinary happens. If you've ever been here, in this silence where only surrender is left, know that this is not the end of your story. It's the place where God chooses to speak. Share this message with someone you love, someone who needs to know that help is closest, precisely when everything seems hopelessly lost. But then, on the threshold of unconsciousness, something happened. A sound escaped Ishmael's cracked lips. It wasn't a cry of pain or a plea for help. It was a whimper, a low, almost inaudible lament that came from the deepest part of his broken soul. It was the last vibration of a spirit that had lost everything, the purest expression of his need, stripped of pride, anger, and hope. The scene was set in the grand theater of the desert. On one side, a mother sobs for her dying son. On the other, a boy, hidden under a bush, gives up his last moments. Between them, a distance of pain and silence. The bronze sky watched, impassive. The world held its breath. This was the end. Or, perhaps, the exact place where a new beginning was about to tear through the silence. That whimper from Ishmael, low and broken, was unlike any sound the desert had ever heard. It wasn't the howl of his mother's grief or the sigh of the wind. It was the sound of a spirit emptying itself completely. And it was that sound, that single note of pure need and surrender, that traveled beyond the sand and the sun. It was a cry that didn't need volume to be heard. It only needed to be real. Then, something shifted. The air, once heavy and oppressive, seemed to hang in suspense. The relentless heat didn't vanish, but a sacred stillness descended on that small patch of desolation. It wasn't the silence of approaching death, but the silence that comes before a revelation, a pause in the fabric of time, where heaven leans down to touch the earth. And on the edge of his consciousness, a voice cut through the silence. It didn't come from the wind or the sand. It resonated inside Ishmael, clear and powerful. It was the voice of the angel of God, and it wasn't addressing the weeping mother but the dying boy. It spoke directly to his spirit, to the place where he lay, broken. "Do not be afraid," the voice said, words that were both a command and a comfort, directed to Hagar but washing over Ishmael's soul. And then came the words that would redefine him forever, "For God has heard the voice of the boy." In that instant, the name he had carried like a cruel joke, Ishmael, God hears, exploded in his chest with the force of truth. God heard. God had always heard. The promise, once his father's distant inheritance, was now his. The voice continued, forging a covenant directly with him, the outcast. "Get up, lift the boy up and take him by the hand, for I will make him into a great nation." He was no longer the son of the slave, no longer the replacement. He was the son God heard, the chosen of the desert, the bearer of his own promise. A strength that was not his own surged through his limbs. Ishmael's eyelids, heavy as lead, fluttered open. The desert was still there, relentless and vast, but he saw it with new eyes. The film of despair that had blurred his vision dissolved. He saw the sand, the shrub, the sky, but now he also saw a purpose, an invisible hand, holding him up. In the distance, Hagar stopped crying. The same voice that reached the dying son, reached the grieving mother. She lifted her face, confusion replacing her pain. Where before there was only a horizon of death, now there was expectation. And then, as the scriptures say, God opened her eyes. It wasn't magic, but a healing from the blindness of despair. And she saw it. There, just a few yards from where she had sat down to weep, was a well of water. It hadn't sprung from the sand in that moment. It had been there all along, hidden by the curtain of her own pain and disbelief. The rescue wasn't created, it was revealed. The provision was present even in the midst of the death sentence. God's provision was there the whole time, just hidden by our pain. May we all remember this. Even when our eyes can only see the desert, the wellspring of grace is already beside us, waiting to be seen. If this story has touched your soul, leave an amen in the comments so we know you've received this truth today. With a cry, this time of joy and astonishment, Hagar ran to the well. The sound of the leather skin being plunged and filled with water was the sweetest music ever composed. She ran back to her son, the water sloshing over, precious as life itself. And when the first drops touched Ishmael's lips, it wasn't just his body that drank, it was his soul. It was a baptism of grace in the heart of the desert, the end of a thirst that was, above all, spiritual. The first swallow of water was like a thunderclap of life inside him. Ishmael drank long and deep, feeling the coolness spread through his feverish body, clearing the dust from his throat and washing away the bitter taste of death. Every gulp was a rebuke to the despair that had consumed him just moments before. Life, which had become a fragile thread, now rushed back into him with the force of that miraculous well. Slowly, he sat up. His strength was returning, not just physical strength, but a new clarity in his eyes. He looked at Hagar, his mother, who watched him with a mixture of relief and awe. For the first time since they left the camp, their eyes met in a silence that wasn't born of pain or fear, but of shared understanding. They had walked through the valley of the shadow of death and had been pulled out together. With his mother's help, Ishmael got to his feet. The act of standing tall was more than a physical recovery. It was a declaration. He had fallen in the sand as the rejected son of Abraham, a boy defined by loss. He rose now as Ishmael, the man God heard, a young man whose identity was forged not in the abundance of a camp, but in the crucible of a desert trial. His gaze swept the horizon. The landscape hadn't changed. The sun was the same, the sand stretched to infinity, but his perception was forever transformed. This was no longer his execution ground, the tomb of his hopes. This desert, with its crushing silence and terrible beauty, was his sacred place. It was his cathedral, the place where God found him when no one else was looking. By that well they made a new home. The simple tasks of survival, finding dry wood, curing the skins of animals they managed to hunt, watching the stars for guidance, became a ritual of gratitude. They were no longer running from death, but actively building a life, sustained by the daily provision of a well that was a constant memorial to God's faithfulness. Ishmael picked up the bow his father had given him, the last physical link to his past. But now he held it differently. It was no longer the toy of a boy seeking approval. It became the tool of a man finding his purpose. Day after day he practiced, his focus absolute, his muscles strengthening. He wasn't just shooting arrows. He was forging his new identity. They lived there, in the great and wild desert of Paran, a land of rocky cliffs and arid plains that teaches resilience. Ishmael learned to read the sand, to follow animal tracks, to understand the language of the wind. He became part of that place, not as an intruder, but as a master of it. The desert that had nearly killed him was now shaping him, making him strong, swift, and sharp-witted, like a true frontiersman. His faith changed too. He no longer needed Abraham's stories to know God. His knowledge didn't come from an inheritance, but from a direct, visceral experience. He met God not in comfort and safety, but in loneliness, silence, and total surrender. His faith was quiet, resilient, and unbreakable, born in the place where the human voice falls silent, and the divine one is revealed. He grew up and became such a skilled archer that his fame began to spread among the few nomadic tribes that crossed the region. He wasn't just a survivor, he was a man who thrived where others perished. The angel's promise that a great nation would come from him was beginning to put down its first roots in that inhospitable sand. He was no longer haunted by the memory of his father's camp. The wound of rejection had scarred over, and the scar wasn't a mark of shame, but a testimony that the rejection of man has no power to nullify the calling of God. He was Ishmael of the desert, and his name, God Hears, was the story of his life, written not with ink, but with water from a well in the middle of nowhere. The years passed over Ishmael like the wind that carves the desert rock. He was no longer the fragile youth rescued from death's door, but a man whose presence radiated the calm strength of one who knows his place in the world. His eyes held the wisdom of the desert, and his hands, skilled with the bow, were those of a provider and a protector. The promise of becoming a great nation began to take visible shape. As was the custom, his mother, Hagar, found a wife for him from her homeland, Egypt. Her arrival wasn't just the formation of a new family. It was the laying of the first stone in the foundation of a people. The laughter of children soon began to echo in their camp, a sound that, to Ishmael, was the purest melody of God's faithfulness. There were moments when he would look at his own sons, watching them play, strong and secure under his protection, and his heart would fill with an overwhelming gratitude. He saw in them the impossible fruit that had been born from that well, the living proof of a promise made to a dying boy. He, the son who had been cast out, was now the father, the patriarch of a new lineage. Decades later, news traveled across the desert on the caravan routes. Abraham, his father, was dying. And then, something remarkable happened. A call, perhaps from the heart, perhaps from a messenger, reunited what had been torn apart. Ishmael traveled back to the land that had once expelled him, not with bitterness, but with the peace of a man who is whole. On that day, beside Abraham's tomb in the cave of Machpelah, stood the two brothers, Isaac, the heir of the covenant of the land, and Ishmael, the prince of the desert. There were no accusations, no tears for a painful past. There was only the quiet dignity of two sons fulfilling their final duty to their father. Together they buried him, closing not just a tomb but a cycle of pain and separation. Ishmael looked at his brother Isaac. He didn't see a rival. He didn't feel the ghost of the old wound. He just saw a man, his brother, the other half of God's complex promise to Abraham. In that moment, he understood it completely. God's blessing for Isaac had not meant a curse for him. The divine plan was big enough for both of them. His validation had never depended on his brother's negation. The final picture of Ishmael is not that of an exile, but of a patriarch in full. From his 12 sons came 12 chieftains, 12 tribes that flourished and filled the desert. He became the great nation God promised, a living testament that God's grace is not a limited resource, but an infinite ocean, with different currents for different children. His story echoes to this day as a balm for all who have ever felt left behind, replaced, or forgotten. Your personal desert, the place of your greatest pain and loneliness, was not your grave. It was your meeting place with God. It was there, at the end of your own strength, that you discovered the true source of your identity. Always remember this. Human rejection, no matter how painful, has no authority to cancel a divine promise. God doesn't just hear the prayers offered in great cathedrals. He leans in to hear the whimper of a boy under a bush. His validation is the only one that matters, and it often finds us not in our strength, but in our deepest weakness. Ishmael's journey teaches us that sometimes you have to be kicked out of the camp to find the true wellspring. His story isn't just about a boy who survived. It's about a God who hears, a God who sees, and a heavenly Father whose covenant with his children will never, ever be broken by silence, by the desert, or by pain.